So could you tell us a little bit more specifically about how German activists crossed to the Polish border and what kinds of roles they had in making this visibility of LGBTQ rights in Poland work out?
Yeah, so I mean, German activists were definitely involved, but in large part it was Polish activists who were in Germany or in other parts of Europe. So this was still very much a local movement, but they had a strong transnational dynamic to it. So we saw that, I mean, the reason Germany was on the map in this case was in part because the proximity, geographic proximity to Poland, also the fact that there's a large migrant population in Germany. There were similar types of activism in other countries that other scholars have also worked on, like Polish activists in the UK that were drawing attention and resources back to Poland. But yeah, at the time, especially around the time of, so in 2004 there was the Equality March in Warsaw was made illegal, and then Lech Kaczynski, the mayor of Warsaw, did that again in 2005, and various Polish cities had banned public assembly by LGBT people. So that attracted a lot of international attention, in large part because Polish activists really tapped into resources across borders and drew attention to what was happening. And then there were buses organized, campaigns organized, and there was also in some of these other cities there was connections to elites that could also place some kind of pressure. That can also lead to backlash. So it's a bit complicated, but we had, by 2006, so the year after the famous 2005 march, which happened illegally. By 2006, there were 32 parliamentarians from 16 different governments that marched in Warsaw. So that, and already in 2005 there were there was elite support, and that's also
parliamentarians from across the EU.
Parliamentarians from across the EU, yes. So Claudia Roth or Volker Beck, in terms of the Germans, are kind of notable examples. Like Claudia Roth was a European MEP in the past, in the 90s, had an important report on LGBT rights, but then as chairwoman of the German Green Party, she was also involved in some of this activism in Poland, at least as a guest, and that also served kind of as brought some protection when the march was illegal, because the state wasn't protecting those marches when they're made illegal. But then obviously if you have embassies bring certain dignitaries to the march, then it actually kind of provides a shield for the march in a way that it creates a space for visibility.
So the ways in which you're talking about how uneven the picture was across Europe is really interesting. And so can you give us some examples of these forms of kind of transnational activism or forms of transnational visibility that made an impact?
Yeah, well, okay, I'll go back to the Polish example in a second, actually, which is an interesting and difficult case. But I can start more broadly by saying, LGBT activism has a long transnational history, even if we look back to the late 1800s and early 1900s and certain campaigns that were done by activists in communication across borders in Europe. And then if we move into the post-war period, of course, with like the formation of groups like ILGA, what we know today as ILGA, what was called IGA at the time, starting in 1978, had a transnational dynamic, and those activists saw kind of a visionary role for institutions like, even before they had a social mandate, for European institutions to be involved in this process. And rights have diffused that way also. I mean, if we think one of the classic examples is like partnership legislation, between 1989 when Denmark passed a registered partnership bill, we now have several dozen countries that have some form of same-sex union in place that has happened in a short period of time, which really helps us to think about the transnational component to what has been often theorized as domestic stories, and that there is something transnational happening that is spreading certain ideas across borders, and that leads states to think about certain issues as needing to be incorporated, or that they ought to be incorporated with the visibility of a group. In terms of the Polish case, that's especially if we think about what's happening in Poland now, it was a very difficult case for LGBT rights. Like many other cases in Europe or many states in the US or all over, we have a lot of resistance to LGBT rights. But there are small steps where you do see changes. Like, for example, if at the turn of the century there was very little discussion by any parties, political parties on the Polish political spectrum about LGBT rights at all, and that was in part also because the Democratic Left Alliance had, their constituents didn't have very favorable views either to LGBT groups. So on the left and the right, there was kind of a gap. But some activists, say that through kind of having the presence of also colleagues transnationally as part of the social democratic bloc in the European Parliament, or by having colleagues come to marches, that it changes the discourse where some parties now think that they must be able to speak about this issue, or that as on a European level, this is part of the left means to have some kind of a platform in engaging on LGBT rights. So those kind of corporations, not to say that they're like implanted from the outside in, but that they create these interactions across borders, create new conceptions of LGBT people in politics. The police protection of marches, of course, which I mentioned before, is another example. Also, we see examples in terms of media attention that states receive when there's transnational activism. Those all have negative dimensions to them too, which we'll talk about later. But in Poland, despite the very difficult context that we have here, we did have, we had a new political party, Ruch Palikota, in 2011. That ran on a platform of representing some kind of anti-clerical platform in Poland, but also brought with it a platform on LGBT rights. They had the first, Robert Biedroń, the former president of the main LGBT organization, KPH, was elected as a parliamentarian, as was Anna Grodzka, who was is a trans woman who was president of Transfuzja, a trans organization in Poland, was also elected. And so Poland all of a sudden had, became a country with, at the federal level, a trans parliamentarian, which we had only seen a couple times before that. So this was, in many ways, some of the landscape had changed. Was the resistance, of course, which we see manifested now in this current government. A trans recognition bill, a gender recognition bill was vetoed by the president, by the new president, but the fact that made it, through parliament, and then also we got much closer to seeing some form of partnership recognition. So this, there has been, I think it would be, despite the backlash which we have to be attuned to, it would be wrong to say that we haven't seen changes. And that is mainly due to, the hard work of Polish activists, for sure. And they've done that, though, in collaboration also with the context of open borders and Europeanization, and also with through solidarity with other activists across borders.
Do you think that there's something, thinking comparatively, unusually transnational about queer activism in this context?
Yes, I mean that's a hard question to answer, but yeah, looking at activism by queer people and a long history of collaborations across borders, there is something uniquely there is something maybe unique propensity to be involved in cross-border activism. I want to be very cautious about saying that somehow queer identities can transcend, other identities like national identities. But some of the activists I talked to, and this doesn't apply to all by any means, but many activists really noted feeling some kind of a sympathy or solidarity with the experience of a queer person in another country. Some of them even said that they felt they had more in common with that person than they do with straight or cis people in their home context. And I think that relates in part to a long history of marginalization of queer people. Of course, whether that holds as, some queer people become more incorporated into the nation, like mainly, if we see some mainstream issues like marriage, which affects certain subgroups, and of course, kind of white upper middle class gay men within the LGBT group have benefited in some ways in becoming part of the nation more. Of course, that might change some of that, radicalism and also solidarity. We don't know how that develops, but I think in general, yeah, there has been a long history of transnational collaborations amongst queer people.